Chris Watts murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. That much the world knows. But what came after left many stunned. His mother, Cindy Watts, did not speak of grief for Shanann. She did not defend her memory. Instead, she attacked it. "We know what she was like," she said. "She was a narcissist. And we support you." Those words lit a fire under an already horrific case. Why would a mother defend her son, a confessed killer, by condemning his dead wife? Was it denial? Was it blind loyalty? Or was it a glimpse into the fractures that had existed long before Shanann's final day? This is not only the story of a crime. It is the story of 2 women bound to the same man, one who built a life with him, and one who raised him, and how their clash of loyalty, love, and resentment shaped everything that followed. Do you believe family loyalty should excuse someone's crimes? Chris appeared differently. Where she filled the room with light, he lingered in the background. He was steady, dependable, quiet to the point of disappearing. Some friends described him as shy, others as reserved, a man who rarely pushed back and never raised his voice. To many, that seemed admirable. A calm to balance Shanann's intensity. Yet, in silence, there can be danger too. Not all quiet is peaceful, sometimes it is retreat, sometimes it is resentment left unspoken. Together, they crafted an image that neighbors admired. A nice house, 2 young daughters, another child on the way. They looked like a family with everything in place, building a future step by step. No one looking in from the outside could imagine that cracks were already forming, or that each smiling photograph would one day be replayed in courtrooms and documentaries as haunting evidence of what once seemed perfect. The truth is, every family has 2 stories. One is public, the curated version we allow others to see. The other is private. Raw, unfiltered, known only to those who live behind the closed door. In this family, the gap between those 2 stories was growing wider. And in that space between the image and the reality, something irreversible was waiting. Can social media ever truly reveal who we are? Shanann came from a place where nothing was handed easily. Life tested her early, and those struggles shaped the way she walked into every room. She was resilient, outspoken, unwilling to let illness or doubt define her. Friends recall her as someone who refused to be small, who met obstacles with relentless energy. She wanted to build something lasting, a life where her children would never question her love or her strength. That drive was not just personality, it was survival. Every choice she made was proof to herself that she could rise above the odds. Chris's story was quieter, less visible but just as telling. He grew up in North Carolina, in the shadow of a strong mother whose presence shaped much of his world. He was a boy who learned early to avoid conflict, who found safety in silence rather than confrontation. His obedience became part of his identity, and as he grew, he carried that habit into adulthood. To friends, he was steady and reliable. To family, he was the one who rarely challenged authority. That quietness, which once looked like kindness, was in truth a shield that kept his feelings hidden, even from himself. When Shanann and Chris met, their differences seemed complementary. She brought fire, he brought calm. She led, he followed. For a time, it worked. But beneath that balance lay a fragile truth: his silence was not agreement, it was avoidance. And her drive to take charge, born from survival, sometimes collided with his need to retreat. To outsiders, their marriage looked harmonious, but within it, the clash of personalities was already marking fault lines. At the center of those fault lines was Chris's mother, Cindy Watts. She had always been a decisive figure, unwilling to step back from her son's life. Shanann, equally strong-willed, often found herself in conflict with her. The 2 women embodied different visions of loyalty, one to the husband she chose, the other to the son she raised. And Chris, true to his nature, rarely took a side. He stayed silent, though that silence carried its own message, a refusal to stand firmly with either woman. This was the beginning of a dynamic that would haunt the marriage. A man torn between two powerful influences, a wife determined to be seen, and a mother unwilling to be replaced. When silence is the only language spoken, resentment fills the empty space. And in that silence, a question lingers, one that would define everything that came after. How much influence should parents have in their children's marriages? In the quiet of their home, small disagreements began to leave long shadows. Shanann's determination to protect her children sometimes clashed directly with Cindy Watts's firm opinions. Something as simple as what the girls should eat became a battleground, each side believing they were right, each unwilling to bend. What might seem trivial to outsiders carried heavier meaning here. It was about control, about influence, about who held the authority within the family. And through it all, Chris stayed where he always did, in the background, unwilling to confront either woman. His silence left wounds deeper than words could. The tension was never a single argument, but a pattern. A birthday party became a flashpoint, a moment that exposed just how raw the divide had become. Shanann wanted boundaries, Cindy saw those boundaries as rejection. To Shanann, it was about safety and care. To Cindy, it was about pride and her place in her son's new life. Neither would step back, and every confrontation pulled Chris further into the impossible position of choosing sides. The one thing he could not do, what he had never learned to do, was stand firmly with one. Inside the house, Shanann carried her frustration like weight on her shoulders. She wanted her husband to defend her, to show his loyalty to the family they were building. Instead, she saw him withdraw, eyes down, words short, the same silence he had always used to escape conflict. But now, it was no longer harmless, it was dangerous. Silence told Shanann everything she needed to know. It told her she was standing alone. For Cindy, the silence felt like proof too. She believed her son quietly agreed with her, even if he never said it aloud. In her eyes, Shanann was the outsider, a woman who demanded too much, who wanted control, who pushed too hard. She framed it as concern, but underneath it was resentment, a refusal to let go. When she said Shanann was difficult, she meant Shanann could not be managed, and for a woman used to being heard, that was unforgivable. This was no longer just tension between a wife and a mother-in-law. It was a fault line splitting a family in two. Every holiday, every visit, every disagreement added weight to the fracture, and Chris, caught in the middle, remained silent. That silence, meant to keep peace, was instead creating a deeper war. And so the question becomes unavoidable. If forced to choose between your spouse and your parent, who do you stand with? The cracks in their marriage did not appear overnight, they grew slowly, almost invisibly, like stress fractures in a wall. Money was tight, tighter than most people realized. Medical bills, the cost of raising 2 children, and the constant chase for stability weighed heavily on Shanann's shoulders. She tried to mask it with optimism, with hard work, with her relentless drive to provide. But behind every cheerful post, there was exhaustion, an unspoken fear that things were slipping out of control. Chris responded not with solutions, but with distance. Instead of meeting the pressure head-on, he retreated into silence, the same silence he had used his whole life to avoid confrontation. He would come home from work, quiet, almost unreachable, while Shanann carried the load of keeping the family afloat. That silence was not neutral, it became a kind of weapon. Every time he said nothing, every time he refused to engage, it deepened the space between them. It told Shanann, without words, that she was on her own. The weight of her health only added to the strain. Shanann had long battled illnesses that made daily life harder, but she never allowed them to stop her from moving forward. She lived with determination, and she needed support, but instead she found herself speaking into a void. To her, Chris's passivity was betrayal by another name. To him, her persistence felt like pressure, an endless demand for effort he no longer wanted to give. In that silence, resentment was born. Financial pressure turned into emotional distance. Emotional distance turned into suspicion. And yet, they continued presenting themselves as strong, united, the perfect family. Neighbors saw smiling faces. Friends saw vacation photos. Online, the marriage looked unshakable. But behind closed doors, two very different realities existed: Shanann's fight to hold everything together, and Chris's quiet decision to let go. This is the hidden danger of silence. It pretends to keep the peace, but instead it builds walls that can never be climbed. A marriage cannot survive on words unsaid, on emotions unshared, on loyalty unspoken. And in the Watts home, silence was no longer just avoidance. It was a signal. It was a warning. So the question lingers: can silence in a marriage be more dangerous than words? When the silence at home became unbearable, Chris sought refuge in another life. It began quietly, almost innocently. Conversations with a coworker who listened, who asked questions, who seemed to see him as more than the quiet shadow he had always been. For a man who felt invisible in his own marriage, the attention was intoxicating. What started as small talk grew into long exchanges, late-night messages, and eventually stolen moments that crossed the line from curiosity into betrayal. To the outside world, Chris still appeared to be the dependable family man. He came home, played with his daughters, nodded along to Shanann's endless determination. But in private, he was constructing an alternate reality, one where obligations faded and he could imagine himself free of responsibility. With his co-worker, there were no bills, no conflicts, no illnesses, only possibility. This was not love in the deep sense, but it was freedom, and freedom was something he had convinced himself he had been denied. The psychology of a double life is simple, but dangerous. The thrill of secrecy creates its own momentum, pulling a person further and further away from truth. Lies begin small, but they multiply, feeding on the silence already in place. Chris was no longer just absent at home, he was actively elsewhere, mentally, emotionally, and soon physically. Shanann's determination to save their marriage only made him dig deeper into that other world, where no saving was required. Affairs are rarely only about attraction. More often, they are about escape, from pressure, from expectations, from the version of ourselves we no longer want to face. For Chris, his affair was a doorway, a promise of a different life that he believed was just out of reach. But with every step he took through that doorway, he closed the one behind him. And inside that closing door was his family, unaware that he was already halfway gone. This is the hidden truth of betrayal: it begins long before the act itself. It begins in unmet needs, in withheld words, in the quiet acceptance of distance. By the time Chris crossed the line, the path had already been paved. He just followed it. So the question remains: does betrayal begin with lies, or with the emptiness left when someone stops being seen? The house was quiet that night, but it was not peace. Silence can be the heaviest sound, and within those walls it pressed down on everything. Shanann had just returned home, exhausted from travel, her body tired but her mind still racing. She was carrying more than luggage, she carried the weight of suspicion, the sense that her marriage was slipping through her hands. She had fought for it with words, with plans, with hope, but hope was now colliding with a man who no longer met her eyes. Chris was there, moving through the house with his usual calm. He spoke little, as he always did, but this time the silence was sharper, deliberate. Behind that silence was a plan only he knew, a storm he had already set in motion. To Shanann, it may have felt like distance, like the coldness of a husband retreating further into himself. To Chris, it was the night he had rehearsed in his mind, the night where one life would end and another could begin. Friends had sensed something was wrong. Messages had been sent, promises made to check in, but no one could have guessed the full scale of what was unraveling. Shanann, despite her exhaustion, tried to reconnect. She reached out with gestures, with conversation, with the insistence of someone who still believed there was something worth saving. But what she could not see was that she was speaking into a void. The man she thought she knew was no longer present. His body was there, his voice still soft, but the decision was already sealed in silence. There is always a moment before tragedy where the world still feels ordinary. Dishes sit in the sink, lights glow softly in the rooms, children's toys rest on the floor. Everything looks the same, and yet nothing is the same. That night was one of those moments, a fragile, fleeting span of hours when the family's story could still have shifted, when choices could still have been undone. But that choice was never going to be undone. It is tempting to wonder, if Shanann had confronted him harder, if Chris had confessed, if a friend had arrived at the door, could the course of that night have changed? Or was the silence too deep, the decision too final? The next morning would answer those questions, and it would change everything. Morning arrived like any other, but the air in that house was already heavy with absence. Shanann was expected to check in with friends, expected to show up as she always did, but her phone lay silent. The girls, usually full of noise and movement, were unseen, unheard. By midday, unease had grown into alarm. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. What began as concern quickly shifted into dread. The front door of the Watts home became the focus of desperate knocks and anxious voices. A friend arrived first, noticing what should not have been, a car parked in the garage, a purse inside, shoes untouched. These were not the signs of a woman who had left by choice. These were the signs of a life interrupted. Suspicion was not yet accusation, but every detail pressed the same question: where were Shanann and the girls? Chris appeared calm, almost too calm, stepping into the view of neighbors and police with practiced composure. His words carried no urgency, his voice remained level, even as he described his missing family. Cameras captured him, his hands folded, his tone steady, and yet behind that steadiness was something neighbors noticed: a lack of panic, a missing spark of fear. Some saw strength. Others saw a man playing a role. The investigation began on the doorstep. Officers moved through rooms that looked undisturbed, through spaces that told the story of a normal family life. Yet in every corner, the silence was louder than words. No signs of a struggle, no explanation for why a mother and her children would vanish without preparation. To the outside world, it was a mystery. To Chris, it was a performance. Neighbors whispered. Some remembered how Shanann doted on her children, how she was never far from them, never unreachable. It didn't fit. It couldn't fit. A mother so present, a wife so engaged, gone without reason. And still, Chris stood at the center, insisting, waiting, watching. The vanishing was not just the disappearance of 3 lives. It was the first public glimpse of a carefully staged lie. A husband standing in front of cameras, asking for his family's safe return, while knowing they would never come home. Detectives began with the smallest details, because in cases like this, the smallest details tell the loudest truths. They watched Chris carefully, taking note of how he moved, how he breathed, how he measured his words. His story was simple: he had no idea where Shanann and the girls had gone. But his calmness, the way he spoke without urgency, unsettled even those trained to stay objective. It wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say. At the neighbor's house, a surveillance camera became the first fracture in his story. The footage showed Chris that morning, loading his truck with unusual determination, making multiple trips back and forth. To the untrained eye, it was routine. To an investigator, it was too controlled, too exact. The neighbor himself noticed, whispering that Chris wasn't acting right, that his behavior felt off. From that moment, the lens shifted. Chris was no longer just a husband. He was a suspect. The interviews grew more pressing. Detectives asked simple questions: where had he been, when had he last seen Shanann, what was their night like? He answered each one with the same flat tone, repeating phrases, folding his arms as if to protect himself. Experts in interrogation know silence can reveal as much as speech, and with Chris, the silence spoke volumes. He didn't stumble, he didn't panic, but he also didn't grieve. That absence of visible fear became its own evidence. Behind the scenes, technology filled the gaps. Phone records showed Shanann's final messages. GPS data mapped Chris's movements. Bank accounts, work logs, and text threads were laid side by side, forming a picture he couldn't erase. Every digital trace contradicted the stillness of his words. It was as though he was trying to live in two realities, one where he was a desperate husband, and another where he believed he had erased the truth. The weight of the investigation pressed harder. Friends told detectives that Shanann had been worried, that her marriage felt strained, that Chris seemed distant. Colleagues recalled his sudden change in demeanor, the new energy, the new secrecy. Each testimony built another layer on the growing suspicion. It was no longer a question of whether Chris knew more, it was how much longer he could keep it hidden. By now, the house itself felt less like a home and more like a crime scene. Every object, every room, every silence pointed toward one conclusion: Shanann and her daughters had not vanished. They had been taken. And the man claiming to miss them was standing at the very center of that storm. The walls of silence can only hold for so long. In the interrogation room, Chris sat under the cold white lights, his arms folded tightly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Detectives leaned forward with patience, knowing the truth doesn't arrive all at once, it leaks out, piece by piece, through cracks in the story. They asked again about the morning, about Shanann's return, about the girls. Each answer sounded rehearsed, like lines read from a script that had been memorized too quickly. Detectives didn't push with anger. They pushed with quiet persistence. They showed him video from the neighbor's camera. They told him about the phone records, the inconsistencies, the way his story didn't line up with what the evidence already knew. Chris shifted in his chair, his jaw tight, his breathing uneven. Still, he clung to denial, the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. But denial, like driftwood, can only float for so long. When pressed about Shanann, the first crack appeared. His voice broke, and for the first time, his mask faltered. He said Shanann had hurt the children. He said he reacted in a moment of rage. It was a desperate story, designed not to save his wife's memory, but to shield himself. Investigators knew it. Viewers could feel it. The narrative didn't match Shanann's life, her love for her daughters, her devotion captured in messages and videos. But in Chris's mind, this half-confession bought him time. Detectives didn't stop. They let the silence sit heavy, forcing him to hear his own story echo back in the room. The more he spoke, the thinner the lies became. He tried to shift blame, to paint himself as a man caught in tragedy, but the evidence stood taller than his words. And for every false detail, investigators had a fact waiting in the wings, ready to erode the fragile shield he had built. What emerged wasn't the full truth, but it was the beginning. Chris admitted there had been a confrontation. He admitted something terrible happened in that house. But he would not yet confess to the scope of it, the cruelty of it, the finality of it. Instead, he offered fragments, a partial truth meant to soften the edges of what he had done. It was a confession that said less about Shanann, and everything about him, a man unraveling, unable to carry the weight of the silence he had built. And yet, outside that room, families waited. Shanann's parents clung to hope that justice would clear her name. Chris's parents clung to their son's words, convinced he was not the monster the world was beginning to see. The truth was circling closer, but in that moment, the world still stood on the edge of revelation, haunted by the question of what he was still hiding. When the truth began to surface, the world turned its gaze not only to Chris, but to the family that raised him. It is often said that in the aftermath of tragedy, silence can be merciful, but Cindy Watts did not stay silent. She stepped forward, her voice carrying a message that would divide families, ignite controversy, and linger long after the courtroom closed. She said she knew what Shanann was like. She said her son was not what the world thought he was. She said Shanann was a narcissist, and that they supported him. It was a statement that did not simply defend a son. It rewrote a narrative. For Shanann's grieving family, it was a second wound, cutting across the grief that already consumed them. For the public, it was a window into a home where loyalty stood higher than truth. Chris had offered a fractured confession, but his mother offered a different reality altogether, one where Shanann bore the blame, where the victim became the villain, where a mother's protective instinct blurred the line between love and denial. The clash between the families became more than personal, it became symbolic. On one side, a family mourning a daughter who had devoted her life to her children, her health battles, her fight to create stability. On the other, a family unwilling to accept that their quiet, obedient son could harbor such darkness. Cindy's words turned her into both defender and accuser, her loyalty painting her as fierce, but also as blind. And in those words, the world saw the raw tension that often lives beneath the surface of family tragedies, the refusal to believe, even when the evidence is undeniable. In interviews, Cindy spoke with conviction, her voice trembling at times, but her certainty unshaken. To her, Chris was the boy she had raised, the son she had known, the child she could not reconcile with the man investigators described. To her, Shanann was controlling, overbearing, difficult, a woman she never fully embraced as part of her family. And in the courtroom of public opinion, her defense of Chris became a battle cry for those who believed love should never abandon blood, no matter the crime. But what does loyalty cost when it denies justice? For Shanann's parents, Cindy's words were not simply misguided, they were cruel. They stood at vigils, their grief visible, their voices cracking as they demanded the truth be honored. They carried Shanann's memory not as a curated image, but as a daughter, a mother, a woman who never stopped fighting for her family. And yet, each time Cindy spoke, it was as if another shadow passed over that memory, threatening to rewrite it. The courtroom would soon decide Chris's fate, but in living rooms, on television screens, and across conversations between strangers, Cindy's words became their own trial. Was she a mother blinded by love, or was she deliberately rewriting history to protect herself from the unbearable? Was her defense of Chris a sign of unshakable devotion, or proof of a refusal to face the truth? The tragedy of the Watts family had already shaken a nation, but Cindy's defense left a deeper question echoing: when love demands loyalty to the point of blindness, who is protected, and who is erased? The courtroom became the stage where every fracture in this tragedy was forced into the light. It was no longer the quiet suburban street or the sterile police station, it was a hall of judgment, where grief, anger, and loyalty collided under the weight of law. Chris sat there, still and expressionless, the man at the center of it all, while the families who once shared birthdays and milestones now sat on opposite sides of the same room, bound by blood through the children they had lost, but divided by truth they could no longer share. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. They spoke of motive, of deception, of a man living two lives, one at home, one in secret. They spoke of a mother and two daughters silenced, buried in the very soil that once held the promise of family. Each word fell heavy, not just because of its weight, but because of its finality. There was no undoing what had been done. The only question left was how the world would remember it. And who, in this fractured family story, would still choose to deny it? On the other side, Chris's defense carried no fire, no hope of acquittal. They knew what the evidence had revealed. Their work was not to prove innocence, but to spare him the finality of death. And behind their quiet strategy, his mother's words still echoed. To Cindy, this was not a simple trial, it was her last stand to frame her son as something more than a monster, to push the world to see the Chris she believed she knew, not the one painted by prosecutors. For Shanann's family, every testimony was a reopening of wounds. They listened as Shanann's name was spoken, not in the warmth of memory, but in the cold structure of evidence. They listened as the children's lives were described in past tense, their laughter turned into exhibits. The courtroom forced them to relive their loss, but it also gave them a chance to speak, for their daughter, for their granddaughters, for truth. Their voices trembled, but they did not waver. The cameras outside told another story. Reporters lined the steps, microphones angled, the public watching as if the case were a spectacle rather than a tragedy. And in that storm of media, Cindy's defense of her son became a weaponized headline. Some saw her as a mother clinging desperately to her child, refusing to let go even as the evidence towered against him. Others saw her as complicit in the rewriting of a victim's memory. To Shanann's family, it was not simply words, it was betrayal layered over grief. As the hearings moved forward, the silence of Chris himself grew louder. He rarely spoke, rarely lifted his eyes, leaving the room to wrestle with his stillness. Was it remorse? Was it emptiness? Or was it the same quiet compliance that had defined him all his life? In that courtroom, even silence became testimony. And around him, two families mourned two very different versions of the truth. The trial was never only about guilt. That part had been secured. It was about meaning. About justice. About how much of the past would be preserved in memory, and how much would be rewritten by denial. And when the courtroom emptied each day, one question followed everyone out the door: when bloodline loyalty collides with truth, which will survive the weight of justice? The sentencing was not a moment of shock, it was a moment of finality. Chris sat still as the judge delivered his fate, a life behind bars with no chance of walking free again. The words echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a door that would never reopen. For Shanann's family, it was justice, but never enough. No sentence could balance the scale against lives stolen. As Shanann's parents and brother spoke, their grief filled the room. They did not use anger as their weapon, they used love. They painted Shanann and the girls back into color, reminding the world that they were not statistics, not a headline, but a family full of laughter, resilience, and promise. Their words rose as a plea for memory, that Shanann not be erased by lies or by silence. Then came Cindy Watts. Her voice was steady, her love for her son unbroken, even as she acknowledged the devastation. She asked the court for mercy, but what she truly asked for was recognition, that Chris was still her child, no matter what he had done. To Shanann's family, it cut deep, reopening the divide that had grown since the murders. To others, it was the human cost of loyalty, a mother refusing to abandon the boy she once held in her arms. The sentence was delivered, and yet, nothing felt resolved. Justice had spoken, but grief remained. Families left that courtroom carrying different versions of truth, bound forever by the same tragedy but walking in opposite directions. The law had closed the case, but in the hearts of those who lived it, the story would never be over. After the sentencing, silence fell on the Watts home, but the silence was not peace. Shanann's family returned to a life forever altered, carrying the weight of remembrance. They spoke her name publicly, they shared her photographs, and they built memorials so her daughters would never be reduced to shadows in court documents. For them, survival meant keeping her alive in story, refusing to let tragedy be the final word. Chris's family chose a different path. Cindy and Ronnie held fast to their belief that their son was more than his crime, that somewhere behind prison walls lived the boy they once raised. They questioned the narrative, they repeated their doubts about Shanann, and in doing so, they alienated themselves from much of the public. To many, it seemed cruel, to them, it was loyalty stitched into their bones, a refusal to let go. The media kept the case alive. Documentaries, interviews, and endless speculation turned the family's private pain into public property. Strangers debated Shanann's character, judged Chris's silence, and picked apart every detail. For Shanann's family, it was exhausting, but it also gave them a platform to defend her memory. For Chris's family, it was a spotlight they could not escape, often turning sympathy into suspicion. In the years after, the tragedy became more than a case, it became a mirror for questions that touch every family. How far does loyalty go? When does love become denial? And what does it mean to fight for the truth when two sides of a family see it so differently? The aftermath was not closure, it was a reminder that wounds this deep do not close. They only change shape, becoming the scars we carry forward. The story of Chris and Shanann Watts is not only about a crime, it is about the fragile ties that hold families together, and how quickly they can be cut. At its center was a woman who fought for love, children who trusted completely, and a man whose silence became more dangerous than his words. Around them stood families divided, one demanding justice, the other clinging to denial. Cindy Watts' words still echo, "We know what she was like, she was a narcissist, and we support you." To some, they reveal the blindness of unconditional love. To others, they are proof of how far a mother will go to shield her son, even from truth itself. Her defense became part of the legacy, a reminder that in tragedies like these, victims are not only lost in violence, they can also be lost in the stories told afterward. The legacy left behind is one of difficult questions. How much of what we see in others is shaped by our own loyalty? When does devotion become denial? And when does silence, meant to protect, turn into a weapon that destroys everything it touches? These are not questions that end with a prison sentence. They linger, demanding answers long after the courtroom closes. In the end, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico remain the heart of this story. Their names outlive the crime, carried by those who refuse to let them fade. And as we step away from this case, we are reminded of one truth that cannot be denied: when loyalty becomes blindness, when love becomes silence, it is always the innocent who pay the price. This story ends inside prison walls, but its echoes remain in every living room, every courtroom, every family torn between loyalty and truth. Shanann and her children are remembered not for how their lives ended, but for the love, joy, and hope they carried until their last breath. Their legacy demands that we speak their names with dignity, and that we never forget the weight of silence, the cost of denial, and the danger of loyalty when it blinds us to reality. If this story has stayed with you, reflect on its questions: where should loyalty end, and where should truth begin? Because sometimes, the difference between the two is the thin line that separates life from tragedy.